I stood in a mansion driveway as my own son laughed, climbed into a $95,000 BMW, and told me I was the reason his life was small. I drove away thinking I'd lost him forever. Then a stranger with a government badge knocked on my door, and revealed a truth buried for 40 years that would turn everything upside down. Before I reveal the next twist, hit subscribe and drop your city in the comments. I want to know how far this tale moves across the world. Dad, this is embarrassing. Those were the first words out of my son Mason's mouth as he dragged his designer suitcase toward his mother's electric SUV. He didn't even lower his voice. He wanted everyone to hear. My stepdad just bought me a $90,000 car for my birthday, he continued, smirking as his friends filmed the driveway. You couldn't even take me to a decent restaurant. I stood frozen at the edge of the circular driveway, the cold biting through my second-hand jacket, clutching a wrapped box that suddenly felt like a joke. Inside was a gaming headset I'd saved for over 3 months to buy. 2 skipped meals a day. Extra night shifts. Counting coins for gas. Gone. Reduced to nothing in one sentence. My ex-wife, Lauren, stepped out of the house then. Diamonds at her ears. A look of polite irritation on her face, like I was a delivery that arrived late. Evan, she said quietly, this isn't the time. Mason's celebrating. Celebrating. Her new husband, Gregory Hale, joined her a second later. Perfect posture. Perfect teeth. The kind of man who'd never wondered how many miles he could squeeze out of a nearly empty tank. He rested his hand on my son's shoulder as if claiming territory. He's made his choice, Gregory said calmly. He wants stability. Opportunity. A future. Mason didn't look at me once. The crowd, teenagers, parents, neighbors, watched in silence. A few phones were still recording. I felt smaller than I ever had in my 46 years. You lost your business, Mason finally said, glancing at me with open disgust. You lost Mom. And now you're holding me back. Maybe ask yourself why you fail at everything. That was it. No shouting. No dramatic exit. I placed the gift gently on the hood of my rusted sedan, nodded once, and walked away while laughter and engine revs filled the air behind me. That night, I slept in my car. Not because I had nowhere else to go, but because going home to the tiny apartment above a takeout place felt heavier than the cold. 3 years earlier, my life looked nothing like this. I'd owned a regional plumbing supply company, Atlas Flow Solutions. 12 employees. A warehouse. Contracts across 2 counties. A modest house in Brookfield with a lawn I actually cared about. Sundays meant pancakes. Fridays meant movie nights. Mason used to sit on my shoulders at baseball games. Then came the collapse. A major contractor defaulted. Another delayed payments. A national chain undercut pricing until I couldn't compete. Within 6 months, I was laying off men who trusted me. Within a year, I was signing bankruptcy papers. Lauren left shortly after. You stopped fighting, she told me. I can't live like this. Mason was 12 then. Old enough to see, young enough to blame. I became invisible fast. Rideshare driving. Food deliveries. Short-term labor gigs. I learned which gas stations had the cleanest bathrooms and which neighborhoods tipped best. I learned how to smile while being treated like part of the vehicle. I also learned that shame is louder when it echoes in silence. 2 weeks after Mason blocked my number, someone knocked on my apartment door. Not a casual knock. Firm. Official. I expected a bill collector. Or worse. Instead, a woman in a dark suit stood there, holding a leather folder and an ID badge I didn't recognize. Mr. Evan Mercer? She asked. Yes. I'm Agent Lillian Cross. Federal Archives and Patent Administration. I need to speak with you about your father. I laughed. My father died when I was 7, I said. You're about 40 years late. She didn't smile. According to our records, she continued, stepping inside, your father, Daniel Mercer, held multiple restricted patents between 1981 and 1984. They were sealed under national security statutes. That classification expired last month. I sat down slowly. My mother had always told me my father was a dreamer. A man who wasted time in a workshop chasing ideas that never paid off. She said he died broke and left nothing but debt. Agent Cross slid a document across the table. Your father's work was used by the government for over 40 years, she said. The estate is owed compensation. How much? I asked, expecting disappointment. She met my eyes. $267 million. The room tilted. But then she added the words that changed everything. There is a condition. And with that, the real story, my father's story, was about to begin. He didn't give me time to process the number. Agent Cross slid another document across the table, this one handwritten, yellowed at the edges, folded so many times it looked tired. This was sealed with the patents, she said. Your father insisted it be delivered only after the classification expired. I recognized the handwriting instantly. Careful. Slight rightward slant. The same handwriting from the birthday cards I barely remembered but somehow never forgot. Evan. If you're reading this, then the world finally caught up to the truth. My throat tightened. Agent Cross continued, her voice steady. Your father's estate is entitled to the funds, but he placed a requirement. You must locate a specific item tied to his original work. And you cannot do it alone. I looked up. What do you mean? You must bring your son. The room went silent. My son won't even speak to me, I said. He blocked my number. That's unfortunate, she replied gently. Because without him, the funds are forfeited back to the government within 30 days. She stood, placed her card on the table, and added, your father believed legacy mattered more than money. He was very specific about that. After she left, I sat there for a long time. The smell of fried food from downstairs drifted through the vents. My phone buzzed with a rideshare request I ignored. $267 million. And I couldn't access it unless my son stood beside me. I laughed then. A sharp, humorless sound. Of course that would be the condition. That night, I didn't sleep. I reread the letter a dozen times, memorizing every word. My father wrote about water. About places he'd visited overseas. About children drinking from streams that made them sick. About building something simple enough to last decades. He wrote about purpose. And about regret. I couldn't stay long enough to teach you this myself, he wrote. So I'm trusting time to do what I couldn't. By morning, I knew I had to try. I sent Mason one last message from an old email account he hadn't blocked. I won't ask for forgiveness. I just need one day. Please. No response. I called Lauren. She answered on the third ring, annoyed. This isn't about money, I said before she could speak. It's about my father. And Mason. There was a pause. You have 5 minutes, she said. We met at a coffee shop downtown. Neutral ground. Public. Mason arrived late, AirPods in, eyes glued to his phone. What do you want? He asked, sitting without looking at me. I need you to come somewhere with me, I said. One trip. He scoffed. Is this another guilt thing? I slid Agent Cross's card across the table. Then I showed him the document with the seal. His eyes went straight to the number. That's fake, he said, too quickly. Then walk away, I replied. But if it's real, it belongs to Grandpa Daniel. And to us. Silence. How much would I get? He asked finally. I closed my eyes. That's not why he did this, I said. But I don't know. We'd figure it out together. For the first time in months, Mason actually looked at me. One trip, he said. That's it. 2 days later, we drove east toward a town I hadn't visited since childhood. The address from the letter led us to a rusted industrial building on the edge of nowhere. Faded signage. Broken windows. Weeds pushing through concrete. This is it? Mason asked. This place is a dump. It's where he worked, I said. Inside, dust floated through beams of sunlight. Old equipment lay scattered like bones. In the back corner stood a workbench that looked untouched by time. Together, we pried up the floorboards. Beneath them was a sealed metal case. Inside, a leather journal, a compact filtration device, and another letter. Mason picked up the device, turning it over in his hands. This thing's ancient, he said. Try it, I replied. He scooped muddy water from a puddle outside and poured it through. Clear water came out. He stared. That's impossible. 40 years, I said quietly. We read the journal together. Letters from villages. Sketches. Test results. Proof of lives changed quietly, without recognition. Mason didn't say much after that. When Agent Cross arrived to verify the find, she nodded once. You've met the requirement, she said. 3 days later, the transfer cleared. But the real change didn't happen in the bank. It happened when my son asked me, softly, can I come back with you? And for the first time in years, I felt like maybe I wasn't losing him anymore. The drive back was quiet, but it wasn't the heavy, hostile silence we'd lived in for years. It was something else, unfinished, fragile, but real. Mason stared out the passenger window most of the way, turning that filter device over and over in his hands like it might disappear if he set it down. You knew none of this? He finally asked, eyes still forward. I knew pieces, I said. I knew your grandfather worked late. I knew your grandmother hated it. But I believed the story I was told, that he chased ideas instead of responsibility. Mason nodded slowly. Mom always said he was useless. So did mine. That admission hung between us. 2 generations raised on the same lie. Agent Cross called the next morning. The verification was complete. The funds would be released in phases, starting with an initial transfer large enough to make my hands shake when I saw the number of zeros. She explained tax structures, trusts, protections, words that didn't feel real yet. You should also expect attention, she warned. Once this becomes public, people will come out of nowhere. She was right. By noon, my phone was blowing up. Old coworkers. Distant relatives. Even people I barely remembered from my past. Most of them hadn't checked on me once during the years I slept in my car between rides. Lauren called that evening. So, she said carefully, is it true? Yes. A pause. Roland hasn't said anything yet. I almost laughed. Roland never spoke until he knew which way the wind was blowing. Mason stayed with me that night. We ordered cheap pizza out of habit even though, technically, money was no longer an issue. Old reflexes die hard. He picked at his slice, then said, you didn't tell me you sold your dad's watch. I didn't want you to worry. He swallowed. I shouldn't have said those things to you. At the party. I didn't rush to answer. I wanted the words to land right. I know you were angry, I said. But what hurt wasn't the money stuff. It was hearing you believed I was nothing. He stared at his hands. That's what everyone said. That you failed. I did fail, I said honestly. Just not at loving you. The next week moved fast. Lawyers. Accountants. Meetings in glass offices that still smelled like money and power. Mason came to some of them, sitting quietly, watching men in tailored suits treat me with sudden respect. It confused him. I could see it. One afternoon, after a particularly long meeting, he asked, why are they all being so nice now? Because they think I'm useful, I said. Not because I suddenly became better. That seemed to bother him more than anything else. We went back to the workshop again, this time with specialists. Engineers. Non-profit advisors. People who understood what my father had built better than I ever could. They confirmed it, the design was revolutionary even by today's standards. Simple. Durable. Scalable. One of them, a woman named Dr. Imani Clark, said, this could change everything in places that have nothing. Mason's head snapped up. Like where Grandpa went? She smiled. Exactly. That night, Mason asked to read the journal again. Alone. I watched him from the doorway, sitting on the floor, surrounded by dusty light and old blueprints, turning pages carefully like they were alive. I get it now, he said without looking up. He wasn't choosing work over family. He thought he was choosing family, just bigger. The first article dropped 2 weeks later. Classified invention released, estate owed hundreds of millions. My name was everywhere. So was Roland's. It turned out the pharmaceutical company he'd built his fortune on had quietly licensed a version of my father's filtration tech years ago, through government channels, without knowing who owned the original patents. Now they did. The investigation moved fast. Federal fast. Bridget showed up unannounced 3 days later, standing in my hallway like she hadn't walked away from me at my lowest. You should have told us, she said. Told you what? I asked. That you weren't a nobody. Mason stiffened beside me. I was the same man then, I said calmly. You just didn't want him. Roland was charged within the month. Price manipulation. Patent abuse. Things far above my understanding, but the headlines were brutal. The BMW disappeared shortly after. Mason didn't say anything when he saw it gone from their driveway. He just handed me the keys one evening. I don't want it, he said. It never felt like mine. Instead, he asked if we could rebuild the workshop. Not to sell it, he added quickly. To finish what Grandpa started. We hired people, real people. Some of them were men I used to work with before my business collapsed. They showed up on the first day like nothing had changed. Figured you'd land on your feet eventually, one of them said. I smiled. Took longer than I planned. The foundation launched quietly. No big ceremony. Just shipments of updated filters going where they were needed most. Flint. Parts of Central America. Places my father had written about 40 years earlier. Mason went with the first shipment. Before he left, he hugged me. Awkward. Teenaged. Real. Dad, he said, testing the word like it was new. Thanks for not giving up on me. I watched him board the plane, thinking about how close I came to losing everything that mattered. The money changed our lives. But the truth changed us. And somewhere, in a dusty workshop that refused to fall apart, a promise made decades ago was finally being kept. Mason called me 3 days after landing. The connection crackled, but his voice was clear, excited in a way I hadn't heard since he was little and used to run toward me after baseball games. Dad, you won't believe this. I believe anything after the last month, I said, sitting at the old workbench, now cleared and reinforced but still scarred with my father's marks. They're already using the filters, he said. Not testing. Using. There was a village clinic that hadn't had clean water in weeks. Kids were getting sick. We installed 2 units, and by evening, people were lining up with buckets. I closed my eyes. Did it work? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Perfectly, he said. No power. No chemicals. Just clean water. One of the women grabbed my hands and wouldn't let go. She kept saying something in Spanish. I had to ask a translator. She said, "Tell the man who built this that my children will live." My throat tightened. "Tell her," I said quietly, "that he already knew they would." After the call, I sat there longer than I meant to, running my fingers over the grooves my father had carved into the bench decades ago. For the first time in my life, I wasn't angry at him. I wasn't confused. I finally understood the choice he'd made, the cost he'd paid in silence. The world, however, was far from quiet. The lawsuits hit like a tidal wave. Not against me, but around me. Corporations scrambled to distance themselves. Government agencies released statements filled with words like oversight and historical context. Former partners of Roland's empire suddenly claimed ignorance, throwing each other under the bus with breathtaking speed. Roland himself tried calling. I didn't answer. Then he showed up. I was locking up the workshop one evening when a black sedan pulled up. He stepped out wearing the same tailored confidence he always had, but something was missing. The ease. The certainty. "Vernon," he said. "We need to talk." "No," I replied, still turning the key. "You need a lawyer." He scoffed. "Don't be dramatic. This whole thing's being blown out of proportion." I finally looked at him. "You built your image on buying patents and choking supply," I said. "My father built something so people wouldn't die. We're not the same." His jaw tightened. "You think you're better than me now?" I shook my head. "I think I always was. I just didn't have money yet." That landed. "Bridget wants to talk," he said after a pause. "That's her choice," I replied. "So is mine." The charges became public 2 weeks later. Mason read the headline before I did. "Dad," he said on the phone, quieter this time. "He's done." "Yes," I said. "But don't confuse justice with joy." When Mason came home, he didn't look like the boy who'd left. He was thinner, sunburned, carrying stories instead of swagger. He dropped his bag at the door and immediately went to the workshop. "Show me everything," he said. So I did. We worked late into the nights, redesigning, modernizing, but never losing the core simplicity. Mason had a mind for it. He saw connections I missed, improvements that honored the original design instead of replacing it. "You know," he said one night, soldering carefully, "Mom always said Grandpa wasted his life." I tightened a bolt. "She believed what was easiest." Mason nodded. "I believed it too. That's what scares me." A week later, Bridget came alone. No Bentley. No designer confidence. Just her, standing awkwardly on my porch with a store-bought pie she clearly didn't know how to hold. "I heard about the foundation," she said. "About Mason." "He's doing good work," I replied. She hesitated. "I didn't come for money." I waited. "I came because I was wrong," she said finally. "About you. About everything." I studied her face. The woman I'd once loved. The woman who left when the numbers stopped working in my favor. "I don't need an apology," I said. Mason needed a father who didn't disappear. I stayed. She swallowed. "Can I see him?" "That's up to him." Mason chose to meet her, but not alone. We sat together at a cafe downtown. No accusations. No yelling. Just truth, laid out slowly and painfully. "I don't hate you," Mason told her. "But I don't want to be bought anymore." She cried then. Quietly. Honestly, for once. The foundation grew. So did the scrutiny. Reporters wanted interviews. Documentaries. Offers to tell my story. I declined most of them. "This isn't about me," I said every time. It never was. But one reporter asked a question that stuck. "What would you have done if your son hadn't come with you?" I didn't answer right away. "I'd have lost the money," I said finally. "And kept the truth." That would have been enough. The Innovation Center opened 6 months later on the same land as the workshop. We restored the old building instead of tearing it down, preserving every dent and scar. On opening day, Mason stood beside me, hands dirty, sleeves rolled up. "Ready?" he asked. I smiled. I've been ready my whole life. I just didn't know it. Inside, mounted behind glass, was my father's original filter. Still working. Still waiting. And as the doors opened and people walked in, not to admire wealth, but to understand purpose, I realized something quietly, deeply true. I hadn't inherited money. I'd inherited a mission. And this time, it wouldn't be buried. The attention changed everything, and nothing. Money moved fast. Faster than I was comfortable with. Lawyers, accountants, non-profit advisors, engineers, global health consultants, all of them suddenly wanted meetings. Everyone had a plan for what could be done. Bigger factories. Faster rollout. Licensing deals. Government partnerships. I listened. I nodded. And then I slowed everything down. My father hadn't built his work to scale quickly. He built it to last. Mason noticed it too. One night, we were sitting on folding chairs inside the Innovation Center, eating takeout from cardboard boxes because the kitchen still wasn't finished. The building hummed softly with new equipment, but the old workshop wall, my father's wall, was still there, untouched. People keep talking about billions, Mason said. But Grandpa never chased billions. No, I said. He chased impact. Mason leaned back. Then we should too. That decision cost us deals. Big ones. A multinational corporation offered to buy exclusive rights to the filter design for emerging markets. The number they put on the table made my lawyer's hand visibly shake. I said no. They offered again. Higher. I said no again. What if we regret this? Mason asked later, not accusing, just wondering. Then we regret it together, I said. But we won't regret becoming the thing your grandfather fought against. That was the moment I realized something else had shifted. I wasn't just rebuilding a legacy. I was teaching my son how not to lose himself. The backlash came quietly at first. Anonymous emails. Think pieces questioning my credibility. Whispers about suspicious timing and convenient declassification. Old acquaintances resurfaced, suddenly friendly, suddenly curious. Roland's lawyers tried one last move. They didn't come after the foundation. They came after me. A civil suit. Defamation. Claims that I was leveraging classified material for personal gain. My attorney laughed when he read it. This won't stick, he said. But they're trying to scare you. It won't work, I replied. It didn't. The government backed us publicly. Documents were released. Testimony was entered into record. Roland's case unraveled faster than even I expected. Mason read the final update on his phone one morning. He pled, he said quietly. I closed my eyes. Not in triumph. In relief. Because anger had almost claimed me more than poverty ever did. And anger would have poisoned everything we were building. The real victory came months later, in a place no headline reached. We were in a small town outside Flint. The water crisis there wasn't new, and it wasn't solved by press conferences. It was solved by repetition. Installation after installation. Training locals. Letting communities own the solution. A woman named Evelyn grabbed my hands after we finished setting up filters at a school. My grandson hasn't been sick in weeks, she said. You don't know what that means to us. I think I do, I replied. She looked at Mason. Is this your son? Yes. You raised him right? Mason glanced at me later, eyes shining. Nobody's ever said that to me before. I swallowed. They're right. Not long after, Mason made a choice I didn't expect. He turned down an offer from a top engineering school that wanted to fast-track him into a prestige program. I'll go later, he said. Right now, this matters more. I didn't argue. Because once upon a time, a man in a rusty workshop had made the same choice, and changed lives without ever knowing it. Bridget tried again to reconnect. This time, I was honest. I forgive you, I said. But forgiveness doesn't mean return. She nodded, tears in her eyes. I see that now. We were polite after that. Civil, nothing more. The world didn't need us to reconcile. It needed us to move forward. One evening, Mason and I stood outside the Innovation Center watching the lights shut off one by one. You know, he said, I used to think money was proof. Proof of what? I asked. That you mattered. I shook my head. Money just amplifies who you already are. He smiled. Then I'm glad we waited to get it. Me too. Because if the money had come earlier, before loss, before humiliation, before that driveway and those words, I might have become someone my father never intended me to be. The filters kept spreading. So did the stories. But the one that mattered most stayed between a father and a son, finally walking the same direction, not because of wealth, but because of purpose. The last time I drove past the mansion where my son once called me pathetic, I didn't slow down. I noticed that fact later, when I realized it hadn't even registered as a landmark anymore. It used to feel like a scar on the city, proof of everything I'd lost. Now it was just another oversized house with too many windows and not enough meaning. Life had settled into something steady. Not easy. Not flashy. Just real. Mason moved between countries the way most kids his age moved between apps. Guatemala. Kenya. Rural Ohio. Flint again. He wasn't chasing headlines or praise. He was chasing problems worth solving. Sometimes he called me exhausted, frustrated with bureaucracy or broken supply chains. Other times he called laughing, telling me about kids arguing over who got to pump water first from a new system. Every call mattered. One night, long after the Innovation Center had closed, I stayed late alone. The building was quiet except for the soft hum of equipment. I walked back into the old workshop space, the part we'd preserved exactly as it was. Same workbench. Same stains. Same scars. I sat down and opened my father's journal again. I'd read it dozens of times by now, but this time I wasn't reading for answers. I was reading to listen. There was a line I'd skimmed over before, buried between diagrams and notes about materials. If Vernon ever reads this and feels like he failed, I hope he understands this: failure is not the opposite of success. It's the classroom. I closed the journal and let that settle. I thought about the bankruptcy. The Uber nights. The humiliation. The driveway. The words my son had thrown at me like stones. If any of that hadn't happened, I wouldn't have been standing there. Mason wouldn't have been standing beside me in this work. We would have missed each other entirely. The world called what happened to me a turnaround. They were wrong. It was a return. The foundation crossed its first major milestone quietly. 1 million people with access to clean water through systems based on my father's designs. No gala. No celebrity endorsements. Just numbers verified by third parties and stories sent in by field workers who didn't even know my name. Mason insisted we mark it somehow. Not with a party. With a trip. We went back to the old workshop together, just the two of us. We cleaned it again, even though it didn't need it. We fixed a loose board. Repainted a section of wall. Replaced a cracked window. At the end of the day, Mason pulled something from his backpack. It was a small brass plaque. He screwed it into the workbench himself. It read, "Built for a purpose. Passed with patience." That was it. No last names. No dates. No money mentioned. "Think that's enough?" he asked. I nodded. More than enough. The call from the government came a week later. Additional royalties. Long-term contracts. Global deployment approvals. Numbers so large they still didn't feel real when I heard them spoken out loud. I authorized the transfers, allocated funds, signed what needed signing. Then I went home and made pasta. Because the money was never the point. The point was that my son called me every Sunday now, no matter where he was. The point was that when people asked him what he did, he said, "I work with my dad." The point was that the word failure no longer lived in my mouth or my mind. Bridget sent a message on Mason's birthday. Simple. Careful. "I'm proud of him. And I'm glad he has you." I replied once. "I'm glad too." That was all that needed to be said. The last scene I'll leave you with isn't dramatic. No courtroom. No confrontation. No applause. It's an ordinary morning. Mason and I walking to the Innovation Center together. The air cool. The street quiet. Mr. Chen waving from his restaurant doorway like he always does. The same street where I once carried groceries upstairs wondering how I'd survive another month. Mason stopped before going inside. "Hey, Dad," he said. "Yeah? Thanks for not quitting. Even when I made it really hard not to." I put a hand on his shoulder. "Thanks for coming back," I said. "When it mattered." He smiled and went inside. I stood there a moment longer, then followed. I used to think my life story was about losing everything and then gaining money. I was wrong. It was about losing illusions and gaining purpose. About learning that being overlooked doesn't mean being unimportant. That patience can outlast power. That truth doesn't need to rush, it only needs to arrive. And that sometimes, the greatest inheritance isn't what a father leaves behind, but what he teaches you to build when you think there's nothing left. If my story meant something to you, if you've ever been counted out, underestimated, or told you weren't enough, do me a small favor before you go. Stay connected to stories like this. Share where you're watching from, and keep listening. Some truths take time to reach the people who need them most.